For the section, we'll drive a little bit more into genetic drift and sort of kind of the loss of alleles. Kind of a short section here. So genetic drift occurs when the chance events determine which alleles are passed in the next generation. This can have effects on small populations. Allele frequencies fluctuate at random. Some disappear and others may become fixed. And genetic variability in the population is reduced. So this is modeling data, starting with a small population of 20 individuals for a gene that has two alleles, A and lowercase a. And just through random chance over a number of generations, we can lose either lower A and fix large A, or lose large A and fix lower A. So this frequency axis here, the frequency of large A, if that's lost, then little a is fixed in these populations. And then in these populations, large A is fixed and little a is lost. And so this can happen pretty rapidly over, we start to see fixation in 4 generations. And so, this is, could be thought of as an example of a bottleneck event, but generally, smaller populations are more susceptible to this. So as population sizes decrease, one of those concerns is the loss of genetic variability due to drift. This can also be a mechanism for speciation, right? If you have a homogeneous population, it's split by a mountain, those two populations might just start to drift away from one another. One way we can look at this is the greater prairie chicken. The populations in Illinois have been reduced primarily due to habitat loss. In 1993, the population was less than 50, and DNA from the population was compared to museum specimens collected in the 30s to show a loss of diversity. And with this small population and this loss of genetic diversity was resulting in some fixation of harmful alleles, and so only about half of the eggs were hatching. This work is pretty cool, and there's it's been growing for quite a while, and actually used to be involved in it. But this work of like ancient DNA, looking at both museum specimens or archaeological specimens, or even natural deposits to get an idea of genetic variability and compare that to today, is really one of the only ways to answer those questions of how have events over the past few hundred years impacted genetic diversity within species. And so here's the Illinois example where the prairie chicken had a much larger habitat in 1820 compared to 1993, where it's really held down to 2 small populations. So dropping from millions down to about 25,000 in 1933, and then fewer to 50 birds in 1993. So there's been a big issue about how to restore this population, and with that, we also need to introduce additional genetic diversity. And so looking at other states that have larger populations of the prairie chicken, so Kansas having 750,000, Nebraska maybe as many as 200,000, and Minnesota only 4,000. And they're looking at the number of alleles at 6 genes to show that in 1933, Illinois had a genetic diversity more similar to what Kansas, Nebraska, and Minnesota have now, but a much smaller genetic diversity in 93 compared to what it had been 60 years prior, and a subsequently low hatching rate. So they tried to introduce members of the population from other nearby states that had higher genetic diversity, and it was successful for a while, but then eventually genetic drift happened again, and those introduced individuals, their genes have fallen back out of the pool. This is pretty frequent where we intervene by moving animals, and the success of that is often mixed. Sometimes it's successful with reintroductions, but frequently those individuals either perish, or if they're able to, they return back to their homeland. And so they tried to interject some diversity, and it didn't seem to really stick. And then we look at gene flow, which is how alleles move between populations via movement of individuals or gametes. And gene flow has two major impacts. Populations become more similar, so you can have, that gene flow. It doesn't take that many individuals per generation, but if you have two separate populations separated by a mountain range, say, and a few individuals make it across that mountain range and successfully breed, that can be enough gene flow to homogenize two separate populations. And new alleles can be introduced into the population. So if there's been a loss of an allele in one population, individuals successfully breeding from another population can reintroduce those alleles or introduce new alleles. So here's an example from mosquitoes, where we've got one population moving out to two others. And so in this idealized scenario, an allele that causes resistance to organophosphate insecticides arises by mutation in one population of mosquitoes, then spreads by gene flow to two other populations. If mosquitoes in those two other populations are exposed to insecticide, natural selection causes their frequency to rise. And so this was seen when we were using a lot of organophosphate insecticides to reduce mosquito populations in the 60s, and the new alleles arose that made them resistant to those pesticides. And so obviously those individuals have a much so strong selection impact, sort of like why am I blanking on the word? Antibiotic resistant bacteria. So antibiotics being a big selection against bacteria. So if this is the R allele, or the resistant allele, we can look at these two populations, and they would not have had that allele. If this is a resistant population, some individuals from this resistant population get blown into these two areas, and they're able to introduce that allele once the selection is happening, i.e. spreading of organophosphate insecticides. Then there's a big selection where the allele is non-existent prior, it's introduced, it exists in the population, but once that selection happens, then it becomes very frequent in the population. So you have to have both the introduction of the new allele and then also a selection event for it. So in the example of these two populations, if those mosquitoes that are resistant to organophosphate insecticides into those populations, but then the pesticide is not used, that allele might not survive. It could come with other costs, and so we would not see this proliferation of that. Eventually that allele probably becoming near fixed in the population. So you have to have both the introduction of the material and then also some benefit there of it. And adaptations, it's features of organisms that improve the ability to survive or reproduce. Adaptations include morphology, physiological features such as enzymes that function at high temperature. So when we looked at the temperature at which photosystems are ideally adapted, that has to do with the enzymes that are functioning in those plants. Here's some kind of crazy adaptations. We have a flying lemur here that has grown this sort of, not really wings, but this like skin that it can use to fly from, or glide really, from one spot to another. This thorny devil is adapted to withstand dry scrublands in central Australia, and the scales are ridged so it can absorb water just by touching it. So even if there's small amounts of water, it can absorb it. and then the archer fish, which shoots a jet of water in the air, and it can shoot this water quite high, and hits an insect, the insect falls in, and it can eat it. So not things that these animals normally do, but some kind of extreme examples of adaptations. And natural selection is not random. By consistently favored individuals with certain alleles, natural selection causes adaptive evolution. Traits that confer advantages tend to increase frequency over time. So we can look at, again, this example of a soapberry bug that feeds on seeds of the balloon vine, where soapberry bug populations in Central Florida feed on a species of an introduced plant, the golden rain tree, up here. So balloon vine, golden rain tree. So sorry, this is on balloon vine. This is the golden rain tree down here. The beak lengths of the insects feeding on the golden rain tree have decreased about 26% in 35 years, providing a better match. So this is individuals feeding on the golden rain tree, smaller beak size. Individuals that are focused on soapberry bugs have a longer beak size, and so the beak size, the beak has to be able to make it to the center of the fruit to suck out the fruit. So individuals that are focused on smaller fruits have adapted to having a smaller beak length compared to individuals that are consuming a larger fruit. There are many examples of rapid adaptive evolution. Again, antibiotic resistant bacteria is kind of one of the faster ones because bacteria have a really short generation time. Insecticide resistant insects has been a common one. Coloration in guppies, make them harder to see. Increased beak size in finches, and then hurricanes is kind of an interesting one of lizards sticking to trees. And so after 2 repeated hurricanes that happened, I think within a 2-week period, they found out that the lizards that remained have slightly different hand sizes, that they have wider foot pads and shorter legs, which is a genetically inheritable trait, and that dramatically increased their ability to hang on to dowels. And so they took a bunch of lizards, made them hang on to sticks, and this is an 80-mile-an-hour wind to see how well they did that. So it's kind of an interesting example of selection where individuals just got blown away. And so the individuals that have a better grip are able to retain. And then there are ecological trade-offs. The ability to perform one function may reduce the ability to do another one. Adaptations present compromises in the ability of the organism to perform different and sometimes conflicting functions. So looking at, this is a female red deer, looking at their mortality rate in relationship to whether or not they have offspring. Now it's important to think this is not just one individual persisting through time, but for a given year, if a 5-year-old doe has an offspring, their mortality rate is, say, 5%. If they don't have an offspring, their mortality rate is quite low, near 0. Getting a more extreme sort of at the later ends of life, 11, 12, 13, where if a 13-year-old doe has an offspring, they'll have near a 30% chance of mortality compared to one that doesn't. This is due to the massive energetic costs associated with bearing young, and that drain on energy typically leading to reduced survival during the winter when resources are scarce. And then even for 14, 15-year-olds that are not having offspring, mortality rates starting to increase now. They're getting older. And so this is not necessarily a choice, but a trade-off between having your genes pass on and having a higher probability of mortality or not passing genes on, and having a higher percentage of survivorship. So in there and come back with maybe 1 or 2 more lectures here.